This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream, unlimited access to the world's best documentaries for you guys. Membership for the first 30 days is free. There is a link below. More about them in a bit, and let's get into it. Almost in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, halfway between the west coast of the United States and the islands of Japan, lies the Hawaiian Islands. These picturesque islands have represented many things to many people. To the Hawaiians, it was the center of the entire world. To the explorers and colonizers from the west, it represented a place full of raw resources to be tapped into. For modern-day tourists, it represents paradise on earth, a place to relax and forget your troubles. And to the emerging empires of the early 20th century, it represented a forward operating base to project their military might further into the Pacific. No place on the islands represents these separate interests better than Pearl Harbor. Originally a shallow bay used by the Hawaiians for fishing and commerce, it attracted the attention of the United States as an ideal location to house their naval fleet. Control of Pearl Harbor was so important to the US, it led them to annex the whole of the island chain as a US territory. After extensive work, Pearl Harbor Naval Base was one of the most important military bases in the world and seen as a symbol of US might. Japan coveted Pearl Harbor as well, hoping to use it as its eastern stronghold in a Pacific empire of their own. When they visited the harbor on December 7, 1941, it touched off one of the most destructive and violent conflicts in world history as the two empires struggled for control of the vast Pacific Ocean. And Hawaii and Pearl Harbor was right in the middle of it. Long before Westerners set foot on Hawaii, what is known today as Pearl Harbor was called by the native Hawaiian people as Waimami, or Waters of Pearl. In Hawaiian folklore, Waimami was the home to the shark goddess. The island in the middle of the estuary, known today as Ford Islands, was used by the Hawaiians for a fertility ritual. Married couples who were having trouble conceiving a child would travel to the islands, and a tribal leader would pair them off with different people in the hopes that having sex with different partners would make conception and pregnancy easier. The Westerners who first visited Hawaii saw that the estuary, which they called the Pearl River, was not suited for large ships because of the coral reef that blocked the entrance, so all of the commercial shipping went through the neighboring Honolulu harbor. That meant that in the latter half of the 19th century, the Pearl River area was relatively undeveloped, and politicians and military officers of the United States saw an opportunity there. In the years after the American Civil War, the United States was looking to flex its power, especially in the Pacific, the one part of the world that wasn't completely within the sphere of influence of the European powers. The US routinely played an outsized influence in the domestic policies of the sovereign kingdom of Hawaii in order to create advantages for American businessmen there. The Navy Department also began to believe that control of Hawaii was key to protecting the west coast of the continental United States, as well as projection of American military power deep into the Pacific. The Navy had been sending ships to Hawaii as early as 1867, but what they really wanted was a permanent naval base located in a sheltered harbor that didn't already have a lot of commercial buildup, exactly like the Pearl River. The US government tried to force territorial concessions out of the Kingdom of Hawaii in exchange for the relaxation of import duties on Hawaii's sugar trade, which was key to the economy of the kingdom. But Hawaiians didn't recognize land claims made by foreigners. They believed that their land was sacred, bestowed to them by the gods and not for sale. But the Americans, driven by their unshakable belief in manifest destiny and their inherent superiority over the Hawaiians, grew tired of that answer and forced the issue. A group of Westerners overthrew the monarchy in a coup in 1893 and proclaimed the Republic of Hawaii, but their real aim was annexation by the United States as a US territory. This was finally achieved in 1899, and soon after, the Navy began construction of a naval base in what was now known as Pearl Harbor. The newly christened naval station required a lot of work. The construction of shore facilities, dry docks, and barracks were only part of it. The harbor itself needed to be redesigned. The channels were deepened and widened through dredging the harbor bottom. The resulting landfill was added to Ford Island, which increased in size and was purchased by the military in 1917. Warfare was in a time of transition. Big, powerful battleships called dreadnoughts were the centerpiece of the naval fleets, and the US Navy needed to make sure that Pearl Harbor was big enough to accommodate these large ships. In addition, the airplane was evolving from a novelty into a useful tool for the military, and both the Navy and the Army used Ford Island as a secure location to build a runway and hangars for their planes. By the end of the 1920s, Pearl Harbor was one of the Navy's premier bases. The powerful battle force of big battleships regularly visited the station, and naval officers played an outsized role in the politics of the territory of Hawaii. It was seen as a key strategic asset of the United States, a forward operating base in any Pacific conflict, the most likely opponent being the Japanese Empire. After centuries spent in isolation, Japan had emerged during the early part of the 20th century as a major player in world affairs. After decisively defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, people in Europe and America began to take Japan more seriously. Theodore Roosevelt, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for helping negotiate the peace treaty between Japan and Russia, predicted soon after that Japan would eventually rival the United States in power and influence in the Pacific. Japan used the chaos of World War I to seize almost all German possessions in the Pacific as a member of the Allied powers and was rapidly emerging as a world power. But like many nations, they were hit hard by the global financial depression that took hold in the late 1920s. The civilian government collapsed, and the military seized control of most of the functions of government. The Japanese Army and Navy were led by right-wing ultranationalists who believed it was Japan's divine right to rule over all of Asia. Acting on their own initiative, the army invaded Manchuria in 1930. And occupied it. They would further take advantage of the civil war in China in 1937 by invading and occupying vast swaths of Chinese territory. Their aggressive actions drew international condemnation, and led by the United States, they began to impose economic sanctions on Japan. This was Japan's Achilles heel. As a relatively small island nation, they did not have the materials or industrial capacity to supply their growing military, as well as their civilian infrastructure, without importing trade goods, in particular oil and gasoline. Without those imports, Japan's imperial ambitions would be starved to death. By 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt felt war with Japan was inevitable, and with the European powers fighting each other, only the United States would be able to check Japanese aggression in the Pacific. Roosevelt began a policy of ramping up national defense expenditures and strategically placing military resources to respond quickly in case of war. This included moving the main body of the Pacific Fleet from its previous home base in San Diego to Pearl Harbor. By early 1941, Pearl Harbor was full to bursting with powerful warships headlined by 9 battleships and 3 aircraft carriers. As the diplomatic situation with Japan deteriorated throughout 1941, the Pacific Fleet readied itself for war, commanded by Admiral Husband Kimmel. Meanwhile, in Japan, things came to a head in August when the United States announced a complete oil embargo on Japan. Japanese military leaders decided that the only way to keep their forces supplied was to seize control of all of the Western possessions in the Pacific, including Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. Since this would bring war with the US, they resolved to hit first at the Pacific Fleet to demoralize the American public and cripple the US's ability to make war in the Pacific long enough to establish their hold there. And the best way to do that would be to attack the fleet at anchor at Pearl Harbor. Now, you probably know what's coming, but just before we get there, I want to tell you about today's fantastic sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers over 2,000 documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. Now, if you're enjoying this video, then why not try out CuriosityStream for free, by the way, and check out their documentary on the USS Arizona. This was one of the ships that was sunk in the attack. It's called Pearl Harbor Into the Arizona, and it uses underwater footage to explore the wreckage of the ship. It's an hour long. It's a fascinating watch, especially if you're enjoying this video. CuriosityStream is available on many platforms: web app, Roku, Android, Xbox One, Smart TV, iOS, Chromecast, Amazon Fire, the list goes on, and it's available worldwide. Get unlimited access starting at just $2.99 a month, and for you guys, the first 30 days are completely free if you sign up at curiositystream.com/geographics and use the promo code Geographics during the sign-up process. It's a great way to support the show. It keeps me making more videos. Let's get back to it. On December the 7th, 1941, the sailors at Pearl Harbor woke up expecting a routine Sunday. What they couldn't know was that a strike force of 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, commanded by Admiral Chiuchi Nagumo, was steaming to the north of Hawaii, preparing to launch an airstrike on Pearl Harbor. The Americans were woefully unprepared for war. American intelligence services had broken the Japanese radio codes and suspected an attack was coming, but not on Hawaii. American ships were at port, guns unloaded and unmanned. Many officers were not aboard their ships since they lived in houses on shore. There was a new radar station on Oahu, but the operators were poorly trained and misidentified the Japanese planes as American planes expected to be flying in from the US mainland. Further, American fighter planes, which could have blunted the effect of the bombers, were parked out in the open wingtip to wingtip to make them easier to guard against sabotage. The Japanese had achieved total surprise. The first bombs and torpedoes fell at 7:45 a.m. Sailors awoke from their bunks to the sounds of blaring alarms, explosions, and gunfire. The Japanese focused their efforts on Battleship Row and the airfields that surrounded Pearl Harbor in order to prevent US planes from taking off to oppose them. They immediately started scoring hits on battleships. USS Oklahoma was hit by 5 torpedoes and capsized. West Virginia and California were sunk, and Nevada was deliberately run aground by her crew to keep her from sinking. But all that paled in comparison to the tragedy of the USS Arizona. Arizona was hit by 4 bombs, the last of which struck her at 8:05 a.m. This bomb exploded outside the ship's forward ammunition magazine, which caused a cataclysmic explosion that could be felt all over Pearl Harbor. The ship was essentially torn in two by that explosion and quickly sank, killing over 1,100 sailors, including Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, the first Navy admiral to be killed in action by a foreign adversary in US history. It was all over after 90 minutes. The losses were devastating. 21 ships had either been sunk or damaged, 188 planes were destroyed, another 159 were damaged, 2,403 Americans had been killed, almost half aboard the Arizona. The American public, which up to that point had been largely against getting involved in World War II, were shocked and outraged when news of the attack reached them. The next day, before a joint session of Congress, President Roosevelt gave one of the most famous speeches of all time, calling December the 7th a date which will live in infamy, and asking Congress for a declaration of war on Japan, which it promptly did. A few weeks after the attack, Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived in Hawaii. Admiral Kimmel had not so much fallen on his sword as was pushed onto it, as he was blamed unfairly by the public and by senior Navy officials for being so unprepared to defend against a Japanese attack, along with Army General Walter Short. Both Kimmel and Short were relieved of their commands and demoted, and Nimitz was personally selected by President Roosevelt to take over as commander of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz conducted an analysis of the damage caused, and on the surface things looked bad, but upon closer reflection, Nimitz realized that the Navy had been incredibly fortunate. Things could have been a lot worse. It was clear to him that surface warships were incredibly vulnerable to attack from the air, and that had Kimmel had advance warning of the attack, he would have steamed his battleships out of Pearl Harbor to oppose the Japanese. If the battleships had been sunk out at sea, they would have been lost forever, and the casualties would have been much worse. As it was, the shallowness of Pearl Harbor allowed for all but 3 of the ships to be raised and repaired before the end of the war. Admiral Nagumo considered launching another attack wave of planes to target Pearl Harbor's shore facilities, the fuel and ammunition storage, repair dry docks, the submarine base, and the Pacific Fleet headquarters building, but he ultimately decided against it. This would have a profound effect on the American war effort, as the loss of those facilities, in Nimitz's view, would have hampered the Navy's ability to make war far more than the loss of the battleships. Most important of all, the Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, so they were undamaged. The loss of the battleships forced Nimitz to change 30 years of naval strategy to focus instead on aircraft carriers and air power. The carriers would now become the centerpieces of the fleet, a doctrine that persists in the Navy to this day. The battleships, when they were put back into action, would be assigned mainly to supporting infantry on shore by bombarding Japanese positions. They saw action against Japanese ships only on a few occasions. The Japanese remained on the offensive throughout the first half of 1942. They had attacked and overrun many Western-held positions, including the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, and they were threatening Australia. They also wanted to invade and occupy the Hawaiian Islands to act as a bulwark against the US Navy. No doubt, had they succeeded, Pearl Harbor would have been a strategic naval base for them, but before they could do that, they needed to draw out the remainder of the Pacific Fleet, in particular the carriers, and destroy them. They planned to do this in June 1942 by attacking the American base at Midway Island, which would force the American fleet to sail out to respond, and then they could be destroyed. But Nimitz, who knew from intercepted radio traffic what the Japanese planned, set a trap for them instead. When the Japanese launched their attack on Midway, the Pacific Fleet was lying in wait for them and launched their air wing to bomb the Japanese fleet. 4 of the aircraft carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor were sunk, a stunning victory that neutralized Japan's offensive capabilities for the remainder of the war. The Americans could now go on the offensive, and over the course of the next 2 years, they persistently pushed the Japanese back, reclaiming island after island. In May 1944, the next target was Saipan in the Mariana Islands. To prepare for the invasion, the Navy was gathering together dozens of landing crafts in the west lock of Pearl Harbor. These ships were being loaded with munitions and fuel needed by the Marines in the upcoming landings. On May the 21st, disaster struck when a mortar round on one of the landing craft was dropped by stevedores and exploded, setting fire to nearby fuel barrels. The fire quickly got out of control, causing an explosive chain reaction along the whole line of landing ships. 6 of them ultimately sank and 4 more were damaged beyond repair. The Westlock disaster killed over 150 men, but ultimately delayed the invasion of Saipan by only 1 day. By the end of World War II, only 2 ships had not been moved from where they had sunk in the attack on December the 7th. USS Utah was a former battleship that had been turned into a training ship. She was struck by 2 torpedoes and rolled onto her side, sinking and killing 58 men. After an initial attempt to right her failed, she was abandoned where she lay and is still there to this day, her rusting hulk partially above water and visible to visitors. The other was what was left of the USS Arizona. It was immediately apparent that the ship was too badly damaged to ever see service again, so no attempt was made to raise her. Her superstructure, still above the surface of the water, was scrapped, and most of her gun turrets were removed to be reused. But the rest was just left there as a memorial and a war grave to the more than 1,100 men who were killed aboard her, whose bodies are still entombed aboard the ship. Today, the wreck is part of a national park. A white marble memorial was built over the top of it, but not touching the ship. The memorial is visited by hundreds of people every day. Oil continues to leak out of the ship, an average of 2 quarts a day. With over 500,000 gallons of fuel still believed to be aboard, it could take another 500 years for it to all seep out of the tanks. Pearl Harbor today is still an important naval base, being home to 9 destroyers, a cruiser, and 16 submarines. But it has been replaced by a naval base in San Diego as the home port of the Navy's capital ships. None of the supermassive Nimitz and Ford-class aircraft carriers are based out of Pearl Harbor, though they regularly visit. Pearl Harbor is also home to the last battleship ever built by the United States, the USS Missouri, which went into service in 1944. It saw action in World War II, the Korean War, and the Persian Gulf War, but is most famous for being the site of the formal Japanese surrender to the Allies in Tokyo Bay in 1945. Today, Missouri is a museum ship where visitors can see her big guns, truly a relic of a bygone era. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to the attack on Pearl Harbor is conducted by the Navy itself. Every time a ship enters or leaves Pearl Harbor, her crew will stand out on deck in full dress uniform to salute the Arizona as they pass her. Another tribute was conducted on December the 7th, 2016, the 75th anniversary of the attack, when Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited Pearl Harbor along with President Obama. This was the first time a sitting Japanese leader had visited the site. The trip demonstrated that old grudges were forgotten and that the 2 countries who were at one time mortal enemies were now friends and allies. It was only fitting that they did this at the place it all began, Pearl Harbor. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, please do check out our fantastic sponsor, CuriosityStream, linked to below. And thank you for watching.